All right, everybody. So we are back after an October hiatus for the November edition of Fic Night here at HPFT. I think it's a good time for everybody to take a little break, winning, not winning, close to winning from NaNo National Novel Writing Month, which we've still got about 4 days left, 5 if you include the rest of today, depending on where you are. Um, but I think it's a good time to take a break to enjoy a awesome story that's already written by one of our own from HPFT, Clever Not Brilliant, aka Claire Evergreen, who is live here with us today. Say hey. And what we're going to do is, as is typical, going to go ahead and start by reading the story, which is a next-gen story primarily centering on Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy. And then from there, we will have live Q&A. Primarily centering Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy. And then for some reason, Al had always ignored everyone when they told him working at the ministry would be the most boring job of his life. Sure, there were some jobs that he figured that would make you want to pull your brains out through your ears, but he didn't want those. Ever since Uncle Percy had let it slip that they were adding a new department of magical innovation, he and Rose had both had their hearts set on joining the minute they got out of Hogwarts. He had slaved over his newts to get the required grades, and by some miracle the department accepted his application to be the newest junior researcher under one of the most prestigious magical innovators in the ministry. He should have listened to everyone else. All of his dreams of inventing the newest spell or finally figuring out how to get their damn electronic alarm clocks to work at Hogwarts had been dashed the second he stepped foot into Artemis Farnick's office. Instead of working side by side with the brilliant witch, he and Rose were shipped off to the patent office, forced to spend day after day surrounded by stacks of papers that mocked him, and his lack of time to do anything that remotely resembled the accomplishments of the witches and wizards listed on the applications. It was rare for anyone to actually come into his office unless they were dropping off more papers for him to look over. So when his door opened, he didn't even bother to look up, just cleared a space on his desk just big enough to put down the stack. When he didn't hear any footsteps and the load of work was not deposited on his desk, he paused in his writing. Oh shit, what did I do now, he thought, bracing himself for whatever lecture Artemis had decided to give him that day. When he looked up, it wasn't the plump dark-haired woman standing in his doorway, but a tall blonde-haired boy that was all too familiar to him. Hey, Scorp, Al said slowly, racking his brain to try and figure out why he would show up at work on a random Tuesday. Were we supposed to have lunch? Did something happen to Lyra? Did something happen to Rose? Oh shit, something happened. Are you busy right now? Scorpius asked, shifting from one foot to the other as he stood in the doorway. Al shook his head, immediately shoving the applications he was working on on his desk, almost knocking a stack over in the process. No, come in, he said, internally wincing at how awkward and formal he sounded. It's not like you've been friends since you were 11, idiot, he thought as he jumped up to pull all the disputed contracts off of the only other place to sit in the office. Scorpius sat down, rubbing his arms and looking at everything in the room but the boy in front of him. Al frowned as he sat back down, leaning forward and resting his crossed arms on the desk in front of him. The awkwardness in the room was so thick that he felt like he could cut it with a quick severing charm, and he had absolutely no clue how to go about fixing that. Fuck, Lewis was always better at this, he thought, as he tried to figure out what to say. Are you okay? He finally said, trying to meet Scorpius's gaze. As he spoke, Scorpius looked over, and, try as he might, Al couldn't read the expression on his friend's face. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. Scorpius looked down, fidgeting with his hands. Yeah, he said after a minute. I mean, maybe. I don't know. He looked up at Al again, this time tugging at the hem of his shirt. Al was about to ask what he meant when Scorpius continued. Rose just broke up with me. Whatever Al had expected him to say, that was not it. She what? Was the eloquent response that was the first thing that came to mind, and judging by the look on Scorpius's face, it was most definitely not the thing he was supposed to say. Did, did she say why? Al asked quickly, trying to get his thoughts straight. Scorpius shrugged, and now that he knew what was going on, Al could clearly tell how much it was bothering his friend. Normally, Scorpius was the animated one of the group, second only to Lewis in how outgoing and overbearing he was. He always talked with his hands, and on more than one occasion had accidentally knocked drinks and people over while drunk, and Lyra had to physically pull him out of harm's way. The person sitting in front of Al couldn't have been any more different, staring down at his lap and looking like he was trying to make his 6-foot frame look as small as possible. You know how Rosie is, Scorpius said finally, pulling out of his speculations. After she was ready to go to lunch, and she just looked me in the eye, said she wasn't sure if we should continue seeing each other in a romantic way. He looked up at the last few words and rolled his eyes, the normal Scorpius slowly coming back. Jeez, Rose, Al mumbled under his breath as he leaned back in his seat, running his hands through his slightly unkempt hair. Is that all she said? He asked louder, trying to gauge how badly Scorpius was taking everything. There was something not quite right about his reaction, but Al couldn't put a finger on it. Scorpius nodded. Basically, yeah, he said, falling quiet as soon as he was done. Al opened his mouth to say something else, but quickly closed it, not knowing what to say. They sat there in the quiet for a good minute before an idea popped into Al's mind. Let's go out tonight, Al said suddenly, earning a look from Scorpius. No, seriously. We'll grab Lewis and go to the Hippogriff and get your mind off of the whole thing. He had no idea where the suggestion had come from, but his gut was telling him that there was something else going on that Scorpius wasn't telling him. Going out to the pub was the only way he could think of to get him to spill. Scorpius sighed, running his hand through his hair. Fine, he relented, standing up and shoving his hands into his pockets. I'll come, but I'm not going to be bailing Lewis out of anywhere if he gets in trouble. Al was about to say something when he saw the smile on Scorpius's face. Al shook his head, and the two of them quickly agreed on a time before Scorpius left to get back to his classes. As the door closed behind Scorpius after he promised not to blow off their plans, it suddenly occurred to Al why he was so bothered by his friend's reaction. Scorpius hadn't even been remotely upset. Remind me why I'm the one who has to stay sober tonight, Al asked as he sat at the bar with Lewis and Scorpius, watching both of them down their third shot of fire whiskey in the past 10 minutes, all of the empty glasses from the past hour laying in front of them. Lewis rolled his eyes as he signaled to Jesse, one of the bartenders, to bring them 2 more shots. Because Scorp just went through a breakup and my boyfriend is still off Merlin knows where in Albania or wherever, he said, breaking off as Jesse slid he and Scorpius their shots. Al watched as Lewis picked his up and downed it immediately. Ever since Lysander had finished his training as a cursebreaker a few months back, he had been traveling more and more. Even though he hid it well, Al could tell that Lewis was starting to get annoyed at how much he was away. Besides, Lewis continued as if he hadn't slipped up, you lot didn't want to invite Lyra to come with us, so someone has to drag our arses home if we get in trouble. He's working with the on-call nurse tonight, Scorpius pointed out, passing his still full shot glass between his hands. When Lewis turned around to flag Jesse down yet again, Scorpius slid the glass across to Al without looking, and Al quickly downed it, passing it back to him before Lewis noticed. Oh, come on, Jesse, please, Al heard Lewis say, and turned to see him leaning against the bar. Jessie just raised her eyebrow and continued to clean the glass in her hand. I'm under strict orders not to give you anything else for at least an hour, she said, not looking at the boys. but Al could see the smile growing on her face. Jessie had only been hired a few weeks earlier, but she had already been proven capable of holding her own against the swarms of waters that always seemed to be at the cowardly hippogriff. Whose orders? Lewis challenged. Al hid a smile, knowing exactly who it was that had cut them off. When he glanced over at Scorpius, he could see a grin spreading across his face. You really think you could come in here and I wouldn't notice you trying to drink yourself into a coma? James said to Lewis as he walked over, handing drinks to the couple sitting next to their group. Al had to put his hand over his mouth to keep from laughing at the expression on Lewis's face. Lewis frowned, turning his attention from Jessie to James. Oh, come on, it's just a few more shots, he said, and Al heard Scorpius snort. You think I'm serving you anything in the next hour, James threatened, as he grabbed the empty glasses in front of them and started to walk away. James, please, Lewis begged, following after him and knocking into quite a few people. Al chuckled and turned back to Scorpius. As he did so, he noticed the two glasses sitting in front of him and looked over to where Jessie was standing. There's no alcohol in them. Your brother didn't say to cut you two off, she said with a smile, picking her rag up again and heading back down the bar. Al picked up the mug and looked at Scorpius, who motioned that they should move to the tables beyond the dance floor. Al nodded, and the two of them threaded their way through the crowd of people, leaving Lewis behind to try to talk James out of his ban. So, are you really okay with everything? Al asked once they settled down in one of the booths, Scorpius taking a sip of his drink. Scorpius shrugged, setting his glass down on the table. Yeah, I guess it was going to happen eventually, he said, tracing patterns in the condensation. When he noticed Al's raised eyebrow, he continued. It's not like we expected to get married or anything. We got together in fourth year because we sort of liked spending time with each other, and somehow it worked. He met Al's suspicious gaze and rolled his own eyes. Come on, Al. Did you really expect that we would have stayed together for 4 years? Honestly? Well, when you put it like that. To say it had been a surprise when Scorpius and Rose had gotten together halfway through their fourth year would have been an understatement. Sure, the two of them got along fine and would spend time together, but they had never seemed interested in each other beyond being friends. After the initial shock, it turned out that they had made quite a good couple, even if it had annoyed Al to no end at points, for more than one reason he had realized back in their fifth year. Over the past year or so, though, he had noticed them spending less time together and reverting more towards the way they'd acted around each other before they had become a couple. He had chalked it up to just adjusting their new lives outside of school, but apparently it had been much more than that. But are you sure Rose didn't say anything else about why? He asked again, something still bothering him about it at all. Scorpius shifted in his seat and looked down at the table. His hands gripped his glass tighter. Look, let's not talk about it, okay? Scorpius said dismissively, and Al was once again struck by how little he seemed to care about the breakup. He watched as Scorpius shifted in his seat once again, his hands finding their way to his blonde hair yet again. Scorpius was nowhere near as tense as he had been when Al had seen him that afternoon. There was something about his behavior that seemed familiar to Al. I don't think I've seen him this nervous since he and Rose. His thoughts trailed off as Scorpius met his gaze, and suddenly, a lot of things clicked in Al's mind. Looking back at that night, he couldn't say what they'd actually talked about for the next few hours, and he honestly couldn't have cared less. Lewis popped in eventually, but he disappeared the second he saw someone they had gone to school with. At some point, Scorpius got up to get them more drinks, and the two of them ended up sitting on the same side of the booth. When Scorpius's hand ended up on his, while he was ranting about some idiot who had tried to rip off one of Uncle George's products and pass it off as their own, he didn't think anything of it. While Scorpius was telling him about one of the patients that he had met on his latest rounds, he didn't give any indication that he felt their legs were touching under the table. And when he trailed off while talking about his latest plans of modifying Muggle devices to work with magic, he most certainly did not object to Scorpius's lips meeting his own. So that was Inevitable by Claire Evergreen, who is back with us. Hello, Claire. How are you?
Hey, I'm good.
So this story is part of your whole sort of next-gen universe. And to start with, I wanted to give any listeners some kind of background from you on how you crafted that universe and how this story fits in.
Well, so this story ended up happening because it's based on the characters from Designated Mom Friend, who is actually about Lyra, who is mentioned a few times in this story. And I was actually talking with my friend because I couldn't decide if I wanted Scorpius to be with Al or Rose, and she just told me why not do both? And so this story came out of that because I was trying to figure out. I just wanted to write something, and Julie suggested that I write Scoreless, and this popped up out of that. It takes place about 4 years, 4 years before the start of DNF, so they are like a year out of Hogwarts in this. And there's also a few links back to a story that actually I haven't written yet, with James being a bartender, and Jesse actually gets to play a big role in DMF 2, which is coming up. So.
All right. Well, excellent. Thank you very much for the background. One of the things that's really interesting about the story is that you've come up with a lot of different, I guess you'd say, atypical, or I guess a better way to put it is not cliche occupations for the years. So aside, like on a new department and like a patent office, for example, for Albus.
Sorry, it's a video. What was that last part?
So I was asking how you decided on a new department in a patent office, like of all places, for Albus.
Honestly, I don't really remember. I think I was trying to figure out some sort of job that wasn't like magical law enforcement or a professor working at like a hospital, and I was trying to figure out whatever. I actually spent hours on the wiki trying to figure out different departments in the ministry that would work, and none of them really seemed to fit. And so then I figured, why not make my own, have Al be kind of like the inventor of his part of the family, and it kind of just sprang out of that.
Gotcha. Now this may give away plans for future stories, so you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But the supervisor, I guess you would say, Artemis. One of the questions I had when I read this story is Artemis really just like shunning him off to do this like grunt paperwork, or is there like a greater purpose to it where, you know, eventually he's gonna have to submit these applications, so he should really be learning from it?
I guess I'd like to say the second one, that she's trying to like teach them, you're eventually gonna have to do these, so you might as well know how to do it. But I think I just wanted him to have one of those bosses that just always pushed the grunt work that she didn't want off to the new kids, made them suffer because she had to type deal.
Fair enough. So in this story, what we also get a lot of is, and what I enjoyed probably the most about the writing of this story is kind of the subtle interactions and body language and everything between Scorpius and Albus. And there's a reference to Albus, I think, realizing that he maybe has feelings for Scorpius or other than friendly in fifth year. What was it like? Was it a challenge to write those dynamics subtly enough that maybe you could say, oh, you know, he's one of these people that's sort of doesn't really show much when he gets broken up?
I don't know. I guess they just kind of popped up into. I don't think I really meant for them to be quite subtle, honestly. Like I was surprised when people were like, "Oh, I didn't expect the ending," and I was like, "Oh, that I thought I was being super obvious about everything that was with it." So I guess no, it wasn't really hard fitting them in because to me it felt like they were mostly obvious, which is probably why. Um, yeah. But I also knew the ending. I knew that they're together in DMF, so it was kind of just drawing off of their relationship in that and just sticking it in this story, showing it how it started.
Gotcha. So do you have, this may be a controversial question, but do you have any particular attachment or preference to the infamous war between Skoros and Scorbus?
So when it first, like when the whole Next Generation like first was a thing, like it first came out with like the family tree and everything, I was totally 100% behind Rose and Scorpius. Like that was the one. It was Rose and Scorpius, and then Teddy and Victoire. I was like, those are the two. My opinion's never gonna change. They're always together and everything. Like every story that I planned when that back then, they were always in it. I don't really know when it started to shift, but there is definitely a moment. I think I started reading more Scorbus stories, and I started to think like, oh wow, that they actually sound pretty good together. But like I said before, this kind of sprang out of the whole. I like them both. They both have their own merits, and I couldn't decide which one I wanted to have in my story. So I just figured that I'd throw both of them out there. And even though it ended up with Scorbus, I still wanted to show Rose and Scorpius too, because I think there's definitely a ton of really good stories about the two of them out there. So yeah, I'm like 50-50, either way, one in each basket type deal.
Gotcha. What more can you tell us about James's bartender character? Because I think you said there might be something more coming up with that in the future. Is that right?
Yeah, I like I said, like trying to figure out careers for all these kids that weren't just the typical ones was definitely a challenge. So it kind of ended up that I had James being a bartender because that seemed like something that a lot of people didn't really pick for them, and he's kind of like bartending because he doesn't know what he wants to do with his life yet. I guess spoiler not type deal, but he does end up well, it's not really a spoiler because he's not in DMF, so you know that he doesn't stick with bartending. He actually becomes a hit wizard later on, which hopefully maybe at this point plays with some tension in later stories that may or may not ever get written with another character who briefly shows up in DMF. It wasn't in this one. So yeah, he was a bartender because I figured that's something a kid right out of school that doesn't know what they want to do with their lives but doesn't want to rely on their family. That's something they would do. Go with that.
Oh yeah. I coached a mock trial student who suddenly became an apprentice sommelier. So it definitely makes sense. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for being willing to share your awesome story with us, so it could be featured on Fic Night and shared with at least our corner of the world, if not the whole world. Is there anything else that you want to share with our audience and let anybody who has or has not read Inevitable know about the story or your universe?
No, just that this is definitely one of those stories that doesn't get a lot of traffic. I just threw it out. I throw it out there every now and then just to see because I actually really enjoy it. So I'm thankful that it was actually picked for this. I really did not expect that at all. So yeah, it was really fun being able to hear it read and out loud and everything. Because like I said, it's been forever since I wrote it, and it kind of always gets pushed to the back of my mind too. So it was fun.
Well, congratulations. I apologize for having to clear my throat so many times, getting over being sick. But congratulations again. Thanks for being here, and thank you everybody for watching. Go read Inevitable and leave some reviews on the story. All right, everybody have a fantastic rest of your day.